everybody. Welcome to the Critical Responses to Anti-Asian Violence speaker series called CRAAV for short. CRAAV is a scholarly and community-oriented initiative to build anti-racist coalitions across Johns Hopkins University and Baltimore. It takes anti-Asian violence as a site at which to develop intersectional frameworks to engage the heterogeneous challenges facing AAPI communities and interrogate the effects of white supremacy on academic knowledge produced about minoritized communities. This interdisciplinary initiative was founded by our colleagues here, Erin Chung in the political science department, Clara Han, myself in anthropology, and Yumi Kim in the history department, and it was launched this fall with the support from the SNF Agora Institute. So I just wanted, before I introduce our speaker, I wanted to just take a moment to thank our co-sponsors for this talk, the Program in Racism, Immigration, and Citizenship, the Alexander Humanities Institute, the Department of English, and the Program in East Asian Studies. So thank you to our co-sponsors. It's a great pleasure to introduce our today's speaker, Professor Eileen Chow. Professor Chow is associate professor at of the practice in the Department of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies at Duke University, and one of the founding directors of Duke Story Lab. At Duke, she is also a core faculty member of the Asian American and Diaspora Studies and the Critical Asian Humanities Graduate Program. Professor Chow is director of the Cheng Shouwo Institute of Chinese Journalism at Xixin University in Taipei, Taiwan, and co-directs the Biographical Literature Press and its longstanding Chinese language history journal, Biographical Literature. She also serves on the executive board of LA Review of Books and as co-director of the Duke University Press book series, Sino-Theory. Professor Chow's research and teaching center around all manners of transcultural storytelling, serial narratives, press practices and publics, fandoms and media technologies, Asian popular culture, Republican era China literary and cultural history, as well as the origins and articulations of Chinatowns around the world. The title of her talk today is The Bones of Strangers on Violence, Grief, and Asian American Kidmaking. So thank you so much, Professor Chow, for joining us today, and we really look forward to your talk.
Oh, thank you so much, Professor Han, if I may, Clara, and Professor Erin Chung, and Professor Yumi Kim, and Professor Toby Meyer Fung, sorry. But Clara, Erin, Yumi, I'm so impressed with this program, this initiative that's been put together. I'm really just in gratitude that the conversation is ongoing and that it was in this moment in March that people really, that really caught everyone's attention, and then the kind of the long work forward is still happening, and I really appreciate that. And I really want to thank Nadine and Hannah for also helping to coordinate things and make this all happen. I'm really appreciative to be part of this conversation that's going on, and I really enjoyed hearing Professor Candace Chow's talk last time as well. And I know that going forward, Dylan Rodriguez and others, and also that a kind of roundtable with friends and colleagues who are doing the kind of hard work that we're all doing of thinking through what it means to create a kind of Asian American community on campus. And not only in terms of supporting students, a kind of social community, but also in terms of activism, and in terms of visibility, as well as creating prime real estate commitments from the university in terms of both our eternal struggle for students at Duke right now are in fact struggling for a more visible space, physically more visible and accessible space on campus for students to congregate. to meet, because it's always been in a kind of B2 basement situation, to the extent that there was a kind of center for multicultural affairs or Asian American studies working group. And so the actual competition for physical space is something that, we are talking about on campus, and as well as creation of departments and hiring and classes. So I'm just really happy to be part of this larger dialogue and larger conversation. And what I'm talking about today, The Bones of Strangers, comes out of both pedagogy and research and the news of the past year, and and so in a sense, the talk today will touch upon all those issues. So what does it mean to think about this kind of longue durée history of Chinese in America, and writ large also Asian Americans in America? How does it relate to the stories that we tell and the stories that we don't tell about Asian Americans? But also, how do we teach this, and why is it important to teach this? And finally, because as Clara mentioned, one of my interests is actually the history of journalism. So my other day job in Taiwan is directing a center that studies the history of Chinese journalism. I'm also very concerned with, what is the role that journalists play and, media play in such a kind of narration, kind of stories that we tell about particular moments of crisis. And so I will kind of talk through my slides a little bit, and but hopefully leave good amount of time for conversation. I know this is a webinar format, so people will be posting questions in the chat box, in the Q&A, but I do hope that we will be able to have also a more informal conversation at the end of the talk. So I'm going to go ahead and share screen. So I hope maybe I'm just going to leave it like this just for ease of movement. So, in some ways, I'm sure, and to say it cynically, that one of the reasons and one of the funding aspects, even though all the scholars involved and all the directors involved in CRAAV are people who have been concerned with these topics for a long time and lived them as women of color in American society. But I feel like, to put it more cynically, this is a moment in which such events are possible, such initiatives are possible precisely out of tragedy, right? That in March of 2021, a horrific event, but sadly speaking, not so uncommon in the United States, a mass shooting, and in which multiple people, majority of them Asian women, were the victims of a killer who was soon apprehended alive. And in the aftermath of that shooting, there's some really, really interesting kind of aspects or atypical aspects of the coverage of that particular this particular event in March. One of it is because this was still and continues to be mid-pandemic, and this in March 2021, really kind of a height of pandemic. There was a really shootings of a kind of high mediagenic nature. There were plenty of shootings that happened in 2020 and 2021, but a mass shooting that was taking place in public space had, relatively speaking, declined, right? Because of the lockdown and because of the changed nature of a lot of businesses. And so this immediately sucked up all the oxygen in the media space in mid-March when it happened on March 16th. And to quote Michelle Lee, the president of Asian American Journalists Association of America, which did heroic work in the coverage soon after, and also of the Washington Post, she said, to put it frankly, because mass shootings are so common in the US, there's a protocol that journalists have, that there are the numbers to the next of kin to reach out to, the social media posts, the GoFundMes that go up very quickly. There's a whole kind of you could say, a whole kind of set of actions that take place very quickly upon such a kind of event in the United States because of the frequency of mass shootings. However, there was a bit of a news vacuum. So I don't know if everyone remembers, but in March, mid-March, when this happened, there was a full day or so in which there was not very clear coverage of the victims. And so what happened was the killer's confession really took up all the news space. Media abhors a vacuum, and this became the main coverage, a whole day of coverage of basically his confession and what the sheriff reported in the arrest. And he mentioned the fact that he had a sex addiction, that he was tempted by massage parlors that offered sex work, and that this was a kind of act of desperation on his part, and also, quote, he was having a bad day. A bit unfortunately, because his was the only voice of the people involved in the first hand of this event, his voice really took up a lot of news and a lot of attention. Immediately after, there was a lot of anger. There was a lot of anger towards thinking about, him having a bad day, his sex addiction to Asian women, somehow implicating the victims as if they were somehow to blame. And also a third kind of voice that was emerging saying the kind of protests against implicating these massage parlors as spaces of sex work to begin with. And then of course, a counter voice to say there is absolutely no problem with thinking about sex work. The problem is the shooting, right? And so, a whole cacophony of voices emerged in the aftermath of the shooting. And including, I think, anger towards mainstream media. The names were mostly mangled, bungled, mispronounced. The second character in a lot of the women's names, the Asian victims, were shortened to an initial, even though that would certainly not be representative of how their names would be written, even in Romanized format. There were impassioned young journalists who recorded videos that went viral. AJA's website went down, crashed for the first time in a decade of its appearance because of the number of people who were accessing this kind of information. How do we make coverage of this particular event? But even in this particular flurry of news, it went from the least and worst covered event to almost the best covered event, where all the major newspapers sent out their best people, and people who also spoke Korean and spoke Mandarin and other languages, in order to be able to talk to Asian American communities on the ground. And so therefore it went from a kind of absence to a plethora of coverage. But in this entire conversation, there was a missing face, and she's not in here, but was really this idea of this woman for whom we only had one fact, which was her name, Feng Daoyou, and her age 44, and that she worked at the massage parlor that Xiao Jietan ran. And there was absolutely nothing else. And so for first 10 days after the shooting, her body was unclaimed and unidentified beyond the name and the age. And so today, what I'd like to talk about is really this whole history of thinking about the stories that strangers' deaths tell us, right? And the way in which Asian American kin making, Asian American community making, and activism often are born from this kind of particular moment of absence and crisis, that, from thinking about a 19th century longer view of the Chinese Exclusion Act and the anonymous railroad workers and others who were detained or lost their lives or were sent away, to a kind of the Vincent Chin moment of galvanizing community, trying a crime for a hate crime, and also a kind of miscognition, a misrecognition of Vincent Chin as a Japanese man, and that also the basis of the hate crime trial by out-of-work auto workers who named him as a Jap, right? Excuse the slur, and called him and blamed him for their unemployment as they killed him with baseball bats. And that particular moment became a way in which Vincent Chin's death gave meaning to already longstanding nascent ethnic studies and Asian American studies movement, but one that was crystallized and galvanized by this particular moment of death and also misrecognition in death. And so for a remarkably heterogeneous community that includes over 55 regions of origin for its mostly immigrant new arrivals, but also encompasses stories of people who are fifth or sixth generation, people whose families have been here since the 19th century, and encompass a kind of the most heterogeneous, you could say, income profile, including the wealthiest Americans and the lowest paid Americans within the similar umbrella rubric of Asian America. This is all well rehearsed and probably familiar to all of you, but when I teach this material, it surprises me to the extent that students are not aware of this, right? That Asian America stands in for many, many things, and your typical undergrad, I assume maybe there's some undergrads here with us, would probably gesture at things like thinking about model minority, or maybe anxieties about interracial dating, or to a certain extent, if they know they have learned in K-12, probably incarceration of Japanese in World War II, or the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. But that really truly is the extent to which an Asian American storytelling, the bare scaffolding on which an Asian American storytelling is built. And so how do you teach that? How do you go about thinking about why there is an urgency to thinking about Asian American community building without resorting to a singular viewpoint or singular focal point, as if one were patronizingly explaining to new immigrants, you don't understand why it's false consciousness for you to vote for X or Y, because you don't understand this longer history of Asian America. It is entirely reasonable for a new immigrant, including the women, several of the immigrants, several of the women who were American citizens, but others who were not, who would maybe argue otherwise. Like, what does this Asian American community mean to me? Even after the reporting improved and a lot of Asian languages speaking reporters, including Michelle Lee, who I mentioned earlier, descended upon Atlanta because they had local ties or because they knew Korean or Mandarin or Cantonese. What they were accessing was a kind of Atlanta-based Asian American business community that was, of course, in shock and in grief and in sympathy, but frankly did not know much about these particular community members in question. So another story that needs to be told, and is something that I talk about a lot in class, is how do we tell these kinds of, in some ways, stories that don't fit a narrower version of Asian America, right? But how does one come to understand that in these moments of crisis? I also was deeply touched way before this year, but by an essay that Alexander Chee, Korean American author, wrote in discussing actually the HIV/AIDS epidemic, and being a survivor of both the epidemic, but also the stigma, as well as the kind of intentional silencing of that particular moment of history, something that we saw even as COVID was discussed, and Fauci was the kind of head of the public health direction for both that earlier moment and for COVID-19. And in this particular essay, Chee reaches back to that moment, the AIDS epidemic of 1991, in addressing his students who are shell-shocked by the election of Trump in 2016. And the passages you see here, I have new lessons in not stopping after the election. If you are reading this and you're a writer and you, like me, are gripped with despair when you think you might stop, speak to your dead, write for your dead, tell them a story. What are you doing with this life? Let them hold you accountable. Let them make you bolder or more modest or louder or more loving, whatever it is, but ask them in, listen, and then write. And when war comes, and make no mistake, it is already here, be sure you write for the living too, the ones you love and the ones who are coming for your life. What will you give them when they get there? I tell myself I can't imagine a story that can set them free, those people who hate me, but I am writing precisely because one did that for me. So I always remember that, and I know to write even for them. And I think this exhortation comes to mind repeatedly when I think about both my immediate response to March 21, but also the absolute lack of surprise I had at that particular moment. In reflecting upon a longer history of violence and grief within the Asian American community, but also seeing the way in which it has led to a kind of building of that community. I should say that one thing I really appreciated in Candace's talk in the first of this series was interrogating the way hate and anti-hate legislation has always played a particular kind of role of displacement in the history of America, as if hate could be legislated away, as if hate could be put to bed by certain kinds of palliative legislation. And but on the other side of that notion of sort of displacement by and kind of putting to bed by focusing on anti-hate legislation, I would argue that there is a galvanizing communal energy to the grief that follows violence in the history of Asian America. And that what this particular event and even the mysterious absence of Feng Daoyou's identity in the first week of after the shooting led me to think about that longer history. I have to say here that I'm trained as a Chinese studies and as a literary scholar. And so my responses are by definition focused and kind of amplified by those histories and those kinds of lineages. And also because, as I mentioned in the beginning, that this comes out of a particular pedagogical practice of thinking about how one might teach an Asian American history while rooting it in the global history of Chinatowns. So my examples are by choice and also by training, by discipline, very much focused on a kind of longer Chinese tradition of grief making and burial and thoughts on bones. But if anything that the Vincent Chin event taught us is it doesn't really matter how one perceives oneself in this particular kind of community formation, but it's also always a complicated dialogue between who you think you are and what other people think you are. And so what I'll do today is kind of walk through a little bit of the way that I think about Chinatowns, the pedagogical exercises or the kinds of possibilities of care and community that we explore in the course that I hope lead to both research, but also activism, both locally and globally. And, but then also to think about the particular story of Feng Daoyou, and I'll come back to her towards the end of this talk. So Chinatowns. So one of the reasons I started teaching Chinatowns was my first job was in the East Asian Languages Department. And in fact, there was no Asian American Studies program, but I had a lot of students who were interested in Asian American Studies. And personally, I was too, as a student of Deva Palumbalu at Stanford. And so once I was trying to think about how I could possibly address those kinds of scholarly interests within an East Asian Languages department, which a lot of places find themselves in. And I know from your disciplines that you're either in disciplinary programs or there's Asian studies, but how does one make a kind of justification or kind of discussion or kind of presence of Asian American diaspora studies, and not see it as a little bit of an afterthought or byway of the Asian studies program, right? And so Chinatowns became a really interesting way for me to conceptualize both a very locally place-bound identity, but one that was also encompassed a story of, because Chinatowns are a space of places, that within a singular Chinatown, um, um, distinct temporalities that are expressed through architecture, through linguistic changes, through cultural vernaculars, through class identification, and through kind of ways of immigration from various different kinds of provinces, and also from different kinds of self-defined nationalities and ethnicities. So Boston Chinatown now is 50% Vietnamese, for example. LA Chinatown, which you see here, the old Chinatown, is over 50% Hispanic. And so it's not a kind of spatial instantiation of Chineseness, right? And so Chinatowns became a really, really interesting way of thinking about the really fictive and constructed nature of any kind of label, such as Asian America. Chinatowns itself is a kind of fictive construction. The gates that mark so many Chinatowns, these are just a few random samplings of gates that go through. This is in Buenos Aires, this is in Glasgow, this is in Phoenix, as well as Dallas. This is in The Simpsons, but that Chinatowns are these really, really kind of interesting symbolic spaces within the city. They function as part of the city space, but somehow hearken or gesture as something that is outside. And also the history of various Chinatowns, both the very established ones like San Francisco and New York and Boston and whatnot, are products often of ghettoization, of zoning, and structural racism, but they also become transformed into these touristic spaces that become desirable, and spaces that that cities feel that they can only exceed to a kind of international profile if they have a Chinatown. So cities such as Sydney or Seattle are, have actively campaigned, and also Singapore, which is a majority ethnic Chinese population, are all examples of places that campaign and actively courted either the KMT in Taiwan or the PRC for funding and support to build, and also the US, the local governments of these places to build a kind of Chinatown. So DC Chinatown actually is one of those examples. And that particular kind of construction often meant that the places were marked by the symbolic, erection of a gate, a kind of traditional architectural vernacular, Chinese architectural vernacular, but also one that is completely a kind of fantasist China, right? So a little bit of an Orientalist imagination. The most famous story, of course, being San Francisco Chinatown, seen as a space of the outside, a space of denim, as kind of a den of iniquity, but then discovered by Bohemians, from Frank Norris to Arnold Gank, the photographer, as the possibility of living outside of the stifling late Victorian bourgeois society that was America in the late 19th century. Chinatown became the space of escape. The idea of being foreign, exotic, and also extraterritorial in a sense, in terms of brothels, opium, gambling. And Chinatown denizens in San Francisco sold it, right? They understood that this was the main appeal of Chinatown. And even as Chinatown was internally becoming more of our actual lived community after the Exclusion Act, and after a lot of Chinese workers had to leave their mining jobs and their factory jobs and their farming jobs up and down the West Coast and move into these ethnic enclaves for their own protection. They these kind of quasi-family spaces were transformed into touristic spaces that showcased the danger precisely as a way of catering to this, this market that craved it. But that kind of playing to the market, as well as being projected upon as a space of fantasy, is incredibly dangerous in times of strife. So if the economic downturn itself was a very quite directly led to the Chinese exclusion law being passed by a federal government with a Congress that represented many, many districts in the United States in the 19th century that didn't even have a single Chinese person. But yet that particular kind of rhetoric of outsiderness and the danger of outsiderness taking hold to pass a series of federal legislations throughout the late 19th century is one material consequence of this fantasy. And the other is, of course, during the 1906 earthquake, the Great Fire of San Francisco that followed the earthquake meant that for a lot of longtime supporters of, which included most of the city, San Francisco City Council and the mayor, of kind of destroying or basically taking apart Chinatown because it was seen as a place of sin and out of control, that the fire wardens were the last to arrive in that particular area of town, Grant and Sacramento, etc. But City Hall, if you know San Francisco, is not super far away. Traditional City Hall was not super far away from Chinatown, that was located downtown. And as a consequence, City Hall was destroyed, papers were destroyed, papers were burnt. And in this particular kind of, another kind of vacuum, and another kind of opportunity arose, which is the idea of paper sons, which all of you are probably quite familiar with, but the kind of possibility of fantasizing or reconstructing a kind of fictive kinship that would allow one to move forward. In a much earlier novel by Fei Ing called Bone, which I have a cover, I want to read a little passage, and kind of this is a particular kind of theme of today's talk. This is about kind of reminiscence of the narrator's stepfather and his arrival into the US as a teenager. Yu Tin Toy was buried 4 men deep, so I pushed into the crowd. So he was my personal favorite of Leon. Leon is the stepfather, Leon's flea bag friends. They met on the SS Lincoln coming over to America. Leon was 15, Yu Tin 18, but their false papers gave them each a few extra years. On the long voyage, they coached each other on their paper histories. Leon was the 4th son of a farm worker in the Sacramento Valley. His mother had bound feet. Her family was from Huiping. Yu Tin was the 2nd son of a shoe cobbler in San Francisco. The family compound had 10 rooms. The livestock consisted of an ox, 2 pigs, and many chickens. His older brother was a fishery worker in Monterey, and his younger brother worked in San Francisco with their father. After Yu Tin and Leon both passed interrogation at Angel Island, they slapped each other's backs. Each called the other brother and predicted the good life. Hao Sai Gai, Leon asked one of the friendlier guards on the island for a word to describe their blood brotherness. Cousin, the guard said. Maybe cousin was Leon's first English word. Yu Tin changed back to his real name as soon as he could, but Leon never did. Leon liked to repeat what he told Yu Tin. In this country, paper is more precious than blood. And one of the reasons that I find the study of Chinatowns very powerful, not only for my own thinking, but also as a way of kind of introducing students, Asian American students, as well as Asian students as well, who want to understand this particular formation of Asian America and Asian American communities, when for many of them, it is not an intuitive catch-all, right? And even the stories of Asian America as a kind of origin story in 1968, as a campaigning for ethnic studies, as part of the civil rights movement, as a kind of coalition of peoples of color. All these things are deeply meaningful to some of them, but to others, especially new immigrants and first-generation immigrants or international students, who both recognize the kind of fear and danger, especially during COVID, of being labeled in particular ways out of their control and being suspected of certain things out of their control, being told that they are automatically become Asian Americans once they arrive in the US is frankly a kind of hard sell. And sometimes, but something I really enjoy about telling, sort of teaching about Chinatowns is both the kind of heterogeneous pathways by which Chinatowns are formed. They come out of, this kind of systemic discrimination, racial zoning laws, federal legislation that basically ghettoized people of Chinese descent or anybody who looked Chinese. But also they come out of this kind of touristic impulse. They come out of this idea to be cosmopolitan. They also more recently come out of a desire to maintain trade, financial, commercial interests and ties with the homeland. And so all those ways in which Chinatowns come to be and are experienced by its activists, by its residents, by its tourists, and by exotica seekers, land upon one thing, which is really both a kind of solidity of space, that space actually creates a certain kind of identity making, and secondly, that Chinatowns come to be through narration, that if you don't have a story to tell of who you are, who are you? Thirdly, that one's particular kind of ability to tell that story has everything to do with a larger story of US-China geopolitics. I have a student who is currently writing her thesis on US-China-Taiwan tensions, and she's freaking out because every week, in some ways, the entire chessboard changes, and she is constantly having to recalibrate her conclusions. And fourthly, that in times of crisis, those US-China geopolitical relations, or those larger cultural contexts or political contexts, dramatically shift, right? So in the Chinese, in the plague epidemics of the late 19th century, Honolulu and to a certain extent LA Chinatowns were burned down with a flimsy excuse of eradication of plague. LA and San Jose and Antioch are three cities in California that have recently made formal apologies to the destruction of Chinatowns, but also globally, that with this, that this kind of moment of danger really reveals a lot of the tensions right under the surface, such as, the transformation of loving Chinese food, bubble tea, xiaolongbao dumplings, to instantly bat soup, and as we saw in the beginning of COVID. And so that immediate transformation or immediate kind of intensification of suspicions that happen, become highlighted in the particular kind of economies of Chinatown. And also temporalities within these spaces, highlighted by the fact that, say in New York Chinatown, January really was when COVID became keenly felt in New York Chinatown, right? Not because there was a huge widespread amount of cases of COVID-19, but all the businesses were immediately in downturn starting from late January when news of COVID-19 hit the world. And so by March and April and May, when economic relief was discussed, and also a recognition that everybody has switched gears into this kind of shelter at home and takeout kind of restaurant economy, Chinatown restaurants had already experienced this for about 5 months, and especially restaurants that were basically cash based and not sort of partner with DoorDash or Uber Eats and whatnot, suffered immensely from this switch to this kind of new consumer economy. But this is, of course, not new to New York Chinatown. New York Chinatown went through a very similar kind of crisis right after September 11th. And so to think about what happens in these moments of crisis, what are the kinds of responses, this is something that, makes it so China, perhaps the overused phrase, but Chinatown as method becomes a very powerful way of thinking about how do we talk about these kinds of affiliations in this sometimes fairly ersatz space. So San Francisco Chinatown was burned down, but San Francisco Chinatown was rebuilt by an American architect who based most of his designs on images he saw in books and photos taken by late 19th century missionaries in China, and his kind of fantastic recreation, including pagoda roofs and curlicue, and a lot of ornamentation to create a kind of traditional paifang, which is what you see for these Chinatown spaces. But San Francisco Chinatown, because of its commercial success and duration, then became the blueprint, the kind of template for all Chinatowns around the world, including Singapore Chinatown, that had a traditional working class neighborhood called Niu Che Shui, but was torn down to build in the 1990s a Chinatown that resembled San Francisco's. And finally, even in places like Barcelona, that in the 1920s had not a single Chinese immigrant, but did have plenty of immigrants from Napoli, from Sicily, from southern Spain, sort of flooding into the relatively wealthier Barcelona city space, and mostly ending up in the area known as Raval. Raval was then labeled by enterprising journalists as Barrio Chino. Right. So he called it Barrio Chino because he had seen many Hollywood films about Limehouse in London, as well as San Francisco Chinatown. So he understood that Chinatown became a kind of shorthand for thinking about how to talk about these seemingly extraterritorial exotic spaces, within the US cityscape or within a national cityscape. And so when he saw a kind of immigrant neighborhood composed of mainly Italians and Southern Spanish immigrants, he called it Barrio Chino. And Barrio Chino as a name stuck. Raval, even into the late 1990s, was still called Barrio Chino, even though it was never a Chinese community. So these kinds of modes of artifice, these ways of thinking about space and temporality, and also, I think, this idea, this genuine experience of the fake, that residents develop community, that, so the new London Chinatown, Soho Chinatown, or as I mentioned, Singapore Chinatown, were commercial ersatz spaces with overseas investment. But in the decades ensuing, their temples, their mosques, their community centers became actual spaces of belonging, and real communities built up around them. And so is not to dismiss and also to kind of sidestep an authenticity discourse that is very comfortable, especially for undergraduates. And to address this issue of what does it mean to have this kind of genuine experience of the fake. So these are all kinds of issues that frame this larger discussion. One of the first exercises I do in this class is to think about, I have students answer the question, how did you get here today? But I hand them index cards and I tell them to not write their answer, but to draw them. With the assumption that most people at a selective college are probably pretty fluent, meaning pretty good at writing. and pretty good at language. But probably a smaller subset of them feel pretty comfortable with drawing in a short amount of time. And so I asked them to draw their answer and to share it then with someone they don't know in the class, and to exchange the index cards, and to try to decipher each other's stories in a language that is perhaps not so fluent for both the maker and the reader. And it allows us to really think about the centrality of communication, of language, of narration in the telling of an Asian American story. How did you get here today? And also that every immigrant story is always about this kind of arrival. And thirdly, that is always about a means of conveyance. How did you get here today? I get answers from cars to Ubers to the shuttle bus to bike to feed to the Big Bang Theory to grandparents who immigrated. But it kind of underscores a lot of the theoretical premises of this course as I lay it out. And one thing, and this kind of connects to Feng Daoyou's story as well, is the ease and difficulty of travel. And for most of my students, when I asked them how much did a ticket to China cost, this is pre-COVID, but if they went for summer vacation or study, most of them will say the answer is around 1,000 to 2,000, 1,000 to 1,500 range. So expensive, but not prohibitive for a middle-class person, maybe with grants, maybe with savings, and for a kind of exciting, summer of travel or study or visiting family. And but for someone like Feng Daoyou, who was most likely brought to the US via snakehead through undocumented channels, and the answer is probably more 75,000 to 80,000, right? The amount of investment that they and their families often have to make. One of the best reportings that came out of this moment in March was, in fact, a podcast in Chinese on 故事 FM that was an interview, long-form interview with a New York massage parlor and worker. And she laid out several things. She herself did not participate in sex work, but she also had no judgment because her neighbor did, plenty of people do. It's just a kind of a sliding scale work in her in these massage parlors and hair salons that she worked in New York. And importantly, in New York, as she mentioned, being caught in a sting for sex work is a misdemeanor. But to be caught operating a health establishment, so being a masseuse without a license, is a felony. And so she said that one of the constant occurrences in her massage parlor is the presence of cops, undercover cops. And she said she immediately knows who they are. They're pretty obvious. But when they ask for sexual favors, she realizes that it's a kind of entrapment, but it's also incredibly dangerous entrapment, because if her answer is no, since she herself did not engage in sex work, the next question was inevitably going to be something about her visa status or immigration status, or whether she had a license to be a masseuse and to be a massage therapist. And so to think about those kinds of legal parameters, financial parameters as part of the story of the means of conveyance is a way to stage those issues of intersectionality for students that are not abstract, right? That allow them to see the kind of dilemma that these immigrants face. So one of the things, and another point in this long form interview is the impossibility for her to return home, not because she had already obtained her green card, but because she and her family went to so much debt in order to come to the US to pay for her travel, to pay her snakehead, that she felt like she could not return home unless her father told her she couldn't go home unless she had basically preparation about 30,000 RMB just for banqueting, just for having banquets for all her villagers and neighbors who invested in her travel. So those kinds of ways become the staging and the kind of discussion about how one might think about solidarity and differences and heterogeneity and also skewed temporalities within the Chinatown space. Another example, of course, is Angel Island. As Leon said, that I read from the novel, in this country, paper is more precious than blood. Paper, but also the paper in the sense of paper sons. This is a recent donation actually to Duke Libraries, found by alumna who found this in her family's attic and belonged to her grandfather. She herself she didn't read Chinese, nor did her mother. And so she approached us and asked if we could help her translate. And we quickly realized that this was, her grandfather was a paper son. This is Arthur Lim. And this is his coaching book, right? He says, my name is Lin Baoquan, I'm 12. And this is a 12-page coaching book that that he memorized in going through Angel Island. But I think that the coaching books, the paper sun, all these things are emphatic of the way in which paper is more precious than blood in this creation of fictive kinship. I also think that it lays out some really interesting issues. One is the legibility and illegibility of the histories of these Asian immigrants and in the formation of Asian American community, and also in the formation of Asian American curricula, is quite fascinating. And instead of looking at my international students or looking at my recently arrived students and who sometimes are wealthy and sometimes feel a million miles away from understanding this kind of collective history of being Asian in America. One thing that was sort of painstakingly preserved are these traces of papers and words and bones that come from this earlier moment. Angel Island, of course, was created to keep immigrants out rather than welcome them in. They function very similarly to the current detention centers along the US-Mexico border. And one of the things that we now know and take for granted are the poems that were carved on to the walls into kind of the plaster of the walls of Angel Island. But in fact, they were not discovered. And they were only discovered when Angel Island was sort of given to the National Park Services, and there was a kind of preservation discussion of some of the interrogation centers, but the walls were going to be painted over. But several community activists, including Judy Young and Him Mark Lai, community activists within Oakland and San Francisco, scholars who were bilingual, who were fluent in Toisanese and Mandarin and English, went in and says, this is not graffiti. You may think this is graffiti, but this is not graffiti. These are the repeated etchings of poems that were written by the first inhabitants of these spaces. And then with every subsequent round of detention, they were then etched, the writings on the walls were then etched into the surface to preserve the original poems, and hence the kind of layering, the depth of the etchings, which allow them to still be visible even with repaintings and kind of refurnishings of these walls. And it was with the work of these activists that, of course, the Angel Island poems survive, and that a lot of these poems that were then collected by Young and by Himmark Lai, and translated, and have become part of the paper legacy, the kind of archival paper and words and bones of Asian America. Another is the literal discovery of bones, right? This is part of Stanford's Transcontinental Railroad project. Leland Stanford, of course, famously made his money, and including the money used to start Stanford, from so Toby, Professor Marfong and I are both Stanford grads, and you know, it is only right that in the last 20 years or so under Professor Chang, Gordon Chang, that the railroad project at Stanford has created a kind of repository and archive of materials found about railroad workers that were brought over in the 19th century. This is the most famous photo of the kind of the linking of the Transcontinental Railroad. Many people have pointed out the absence of Chinese workers in this image. The railroad project argues that maybe there is a kind of spectral trace, a ghostly trace of one of these workers with his back turned, but judging by dress, that maybe he was present in this historic photo. And also the railroad project has gone a long way to collecting images of Chinese and Chinese workers that are the kind of ghostly presence of them in other kinds of spaces, right? Not documenting the successful building of the railroad, but say in a stereoscope, you know, free images given out with a stereoscope. And also to kind of unexcavate the sort of powerful stories of these workers through their actions, through their activism. So one of the stories that the stereotypes of Chinese, and one of the things that was a repeated refrain in the Stop Asian Hate campaign was essential passivity, or Chinese are, or Asian Americans are finally angry and doing something about it. Well, no, they've been doing things about it all. This is, I'm speaking to the converters, so all of you already know this history, but of course, a long history of coalition building, of activism has long existed within Asian America. But is the kind of recovery of some of the lesser known stories also allowing for a different kind of narration, a different kind of storytelling to be created about Asian America. So one of the first railroad strikes, the first labor strike on the railroad, was by Chinese workers who demanded fair wages, as they did the most backbreaking and dangerous work in the Sierra Nevadas, and Stanford having to kind of concede to that. Another kind of image of Chinatowns and of early Asian America is the lack of presence of families and lack of culture. You know, that one of the sort of divides is thinking of this earlier community as basically devoid of high culture, devoid of Chinese, that later communities felt like they were bringing, even in the way that people fairly innocuously talk about how good cuisine is finally entering with the middle class migration, but to recognize the whole history of rituals and daily life and practices existed here. And so to return to this photo and to now resurface the Chinese worker in it. Even in the 100th anniversary of the Transcontinental Railroad, there was a very kind of, you could say, what was then thought liberal reenactment by inserting or reinserting Chinamen, right, Chinese into this historic moment. But the Chinese, as they're represented by the governor of Utah, who staged, and this event was still imagining not as a kind of active worker participating in his communal rights, but rather these, kind of faceless, stereotypically dressed Chinese in costume, but in recovering the photos and kind of rethinking the image of these workers, often dressed like people in the West did for harsh winters, Western coats, dungarees, And finally, in the 150th China reunion of the Transcontinental Railroad, the coming together of all the descendants that could participate in this particular moment. So one of the things I've always been fascinated by is these kinds of material remnants, be it etchings on walls, poems, ephemeral poems, scraps of paper that are coaching books and, false identities, but of also gravestones, right? To think about what is it that was left behind and how we might read these bones of strangers. So one of the central contracts that that was in a lot of the railroad workers' contracts was that their bones would be returned to their ancestral homes, right? And this is true now even for migrant workers in China, that for coal miners or others doing backbreaking construction work or coal mining work in other provinces, one of the stipulated items in their contracts is the returning of their bones for burial in their ancestral provinces. And this was true for documents that we've discovered from the 1860s and 70s. But at the end of the building of the Transcontinental Railroad, it was somewhat fulfilled. It was not truly fulfilled. What happened was in 1870, in a particular, a giant shipment of 12,000 pounds of bones was sent back to Canton. And so in a kind of gesture of fulfilling this contractual obligation, but also the melding together of countless people's bones, strangers' bones into a container, and only to be returned to a kind of generalized space. And that particular kind of, fictionalized, or I shouldn't say fictionalized, fictive kinship, right? Actually lays bare the fictiveness of all kinship. We know this from Levi-Strauss. We know this, from Hortense Spiller's, Papa's maybe, Mama's baby, Mama's baby, Papa's maybe, right? That you can say patriarchal society is always about the anxiety of actual lineage. And in some ways, kinship is always fictive. But the immigrant workers' kinship of who to build trust with in a new land, who to build trust with in exile, and whose bones would end up being next to one, is the story of Asian America. It's the story of how certain kinds of heterogeneous communities and peoples come together in a particular moment of death or violence or grief to cement a new kind of kinship, as Leon says, cousins, right? Paper is more precious than blood. And in this particular case, these 12,000 bones find their home in Canton, now melded together. Their shared experience of work and their solidarity is their work in a far away from home. In a completely different context of mainland Chinese who were drafted by the KMT and ended up in defeat, retreating to the island with Chiang Kai-shek and his administration onto Taiwan. There's an anecdote from one of these military villages that a lot of these former soldiers ended up in. So a lot of these soldiers were drafted. They weren't KMT elite. They were just soldiers who were drafted, fought in the KMT, and then ended up retreating to Taiwan so they wouldn't be executed in China. And one author, Chen Hao, mentions that when he was a kid, his family was from North China. He asked his father what 朋友 meant, friend, right? Because he noticed that his father called all sorts of people 朋友, kind of like cousin in that context, but in this word friend. And his father said, 朋友是可以托孤的, meaning friends are those with whom one can entrust one's young, should they be orphaned, right? So in the absence of blood kinship, in the absence of kind of ancestral lineage, the immigrant's plight is about creating horizontal alliances to guarantee that their children and their bones are taken care of. And this is not limited to the US. I know that I've gone on long, so I will wrap up, but that they, to look at, to think about the 150,000 or so who fought on the Allied side during World War I and found themselves buried there. But to also think about the cemetery in the outskirts of Boston that is now no longer legible, of gravestones of where one can see partial names in Chinese, and with probably no next of kin able to find or tend to these gravestones. And finally, just to kind of return to the topic at hand, I'm going to skip a little bit towards the middle. I mentioned that in the moment of grief, one of the things that was really, really hard to discover was who was Feng Daoyou, that for 10 days, there was a kind of silence, there's a kind of invisibility. There was no way to trace the kind of stories about her. And finally, the Atlanta Chinese Association ended up throwing a funeral for her. And with not much more than her picture. This picture, as you can see, that was then part of her funeral process. Only about 2 weeks in, then there was more. They located her next of kin, her brother, who in some ways also had very, very vague memories of her too. They found, they had a few selfies that she had sent over the years. She is from Guangzhou. Her family with two older brothers. She left school in elementary or maybe junior high in order to, and her family doesn't even remember clearly, but in order to work and send money home to support her older brother's family and also her mother. Her father had passed away while she was young. And then she eventually made it to the United States, working in massage parlors. And in this, particular moment, the legibility of her story was not about language, but it was also about being poor, about being a woman, and of having not a story that can be told. Similarly, the oldest victim of Atlanta, Sundun Park, 74, there was a kind of news shutdown from her family that was in New York, her daughter and her son-in-law. And later it emerged from this young man, her husband, is because that her story was very much part of was that she had left her daughter's house in New York to work in Atlanta, and she married a very younger man in his 30s in order to help him get a green card, but to get a visa status, but also, as he explains, out of love. But the kinds of unruly stories, the kinds of stories about people who are multiracial, Yu's family, are stories that were not possible to be located or traced. And also a discussion of ownership, and that a lot of the attention focused on the women as kind of individual subjects to the extent that their stories could be found, but not recognizing also the wealthy Taiwanese businessman who won Taiwanese American Businessman of the Year in Taiwan last year, was the owner of the property that a lot of these spas found them on. So that kind of illegibility and how to kind of recover that kind of story. I just want to end by one, and I'm sorry I went on so long, but one final story about the being part of the Bones of Strangers is that this is a Mei-Ling Lee, San Francisco-based artist who created a series of installations based on bones that could not be transported home. So not part of the many tens and thousands and tons of bones that were sent home haphazardly, but often that were temporarily displaced in Hong Kong. And there is a charity hospital in Hong Kong that's been housing these bones and burning incense every day to these sometimes 100-year-old bones that have no home destination, but also have no way of returning back to their second homes in California. And Mei-Ling Lee used that history to create a series of installations of these bones that are forever in transit. And in the case of Feng Daoyou, once the Atlanta Association did throw a funeral for her and make the kind of Confucian gesture of burying a stranger's bones. This is something that, from Zhang Huan to Wang Yangming to a kind of gesture of praying and honoring those strangers on the roadside, the corpses on the roadside, the bones that could be you. The Atlanta Association offered to ship her bones on their expense back to her brother in Zhuhai. But her brother said, I'm sorry, we can't receive them because our local custom is that unmarried women cannot return home for burial. And so in this particular kind of limbo of being neither home, neither here nor there, too foreign for home, too foreign for here, is the story of Feng Daoyou, but is also a kind of generative Asian American community building and the possibility of recognizing the fictive kinship that must become real, and even if one deems it fictive. So I should end here. I'm very sorry that I went on so long.
Sorry, I was muted. This is a really fascinating talk, Eileen, Professor Chow. We have a Q&A box for anybody who would like to put their questions into the Q&A. We also have our panelists who are also able to ask questions now, if you have any questions you'd like to start with. Yeah, Toby.
Hey, Eileen, it's wonderful to hear your thoughts and to think alongside you again. That was really powerful and generative. And I keep coming back to the image of blood and paper as a kind of juxtaposition and as a way of thinking of, like, what if we're going to use blood and paper as metaphors, what do they stand for? And what are and can they stand for multiple things at once? And alongside that, just thinking in terms of paper can be generative and creative, but it can also paper over, right? So it can be that thing onto which we invent ourselves or project ourselves, or a site of self-invention and possibility in a new space. Mm-hmm. But it can also be used to render invisible the kind of tension. And I was thinking, so if we are going to write on the paper that makes us paper sons, right? Or if we're going to make creative use of the documentary lies that make lives possible. And I've been thinking about this a lot in relation to family stories and the kinds of lies that make lives possible. Right. Like, what are the tensions that must be erased in order for those creative acts to come into being, right? So in your talk, I saw so many sites of potential tension, right? Generational difference, class difference, gender difference, status difference, immigration status difference, place of origin difference, things that might be more salient there than here that become invisible through acts of migration. And so I guess in the generative exercise in your class, you asked about the price of travel, but I wondered also about the cost of travel. Like, what do you have to lose in order to become? So those were just a couple of flashes of thought that struck me as I was listening to you talk.
Yeah, you know, so many, such a great comment. I'm not sure that, you know, any of it could be easily answered, but it's more that I love that you were thinking, I love that you put it so kindly, that you were thinking alongside me, and that's, you know, what I hoped, you know, that this is, you know, that I want to try to create within my students, within my colleagues, within my communities, to think about how to thicken, you know, sort of tenuous ties of solidarity, right? So, you know, that must Asian America only come to be visible to itself in these moments of crisis, right? And so that's something that, I mean, including your initiative, right? Like, is anti-Asianness a kind of constitutive of this, you know, but I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. You know, like in journalism, you know, one thinks about both telling a story in linear time, chronos, but also the kind of, if you did in high school debate, but kairos, like what is the best, sharpest moment to inject, you know, of telling in order to have it make the maximum impact, right? So that kind of kairetic telling is what I'm trying to do with these sort of injecting moments into rather this kind of larger amorphous landscape of, oh, we are Asian Americans and we should all like each other, you know, but rather to kind of throw it in there and to focus on that as these kind of punctum, like puncta, you know, like points in which you can inject. Yeah, but.
Just a quick follow-up, just to be a little bit provocative on that point of taking crisis as generative. Just an anecdote. I remember a couple of years ago, maybe a decade ago, riding the subway in New York, and a very well-dressed Chinese American couple was in their early 20s. They looked like recent college grads. They were having a conversation about what it meant to be Asian American. And I was sitting next to them, and I confess I was eavesdropping. And they said, wouldn't it be, basically the entire tenor of the conversation was one of regretting that they, as Chinese Americans, didn't have a story of suffering like the Japanese Americans that would make it possible for them to have a meaningful identity. And I was biting my tongue because they obviously were not thinking about it. You know, my pedagogical brain was working overtime on that, but I thought it was really interesting and provocative. Do we need these sites of victimhood and suffering in order to engender community? Right. And why must this be relativized? Who suffered more becomes part of the story in a very...
I feel like competitive victimhood and competitive suffering is the greatest misapprehension, I think, right, of American history, right? That somehow this is all a race to, you know, to kind of say who suffered more. And unfortunately, I wonder if it's a little Calvinist, you know, like it's a little bit like, you know, and hopefully grief is not victimhood, right? Grief is kind of acknowledging violence and saying what one builds creatively from that moment, right? You know, rather than kind of, you know, God, to use Freud, you know, not mourning and not melancholia, right? Like, but how to use mourning as a kind of site of generative energy. Similarly, like Chinatown's a kind of genuine experience of the fate. Just because somebody gave you a pagoda roof doesn't mean it can't be a good roof, right? Like, you know, that you can still kind of build something really interesting and really for the community out of it. I guess that's, but the competitive suffering is painful, but it also really bites one in the butt in the other way, right? That, you know, high school students, Asian students are often, middle-class Asian students are often told that affirmative action is terrible for them. And so my students who are liberal and are always quite skeptical about affirmative action because of that, right? They think that they don't, but they also but, you know, even though a lot of them do kind of understand the nuances and come to embrace it for different kinds of reasons, they don't need to be kind of told in a superior way that they just don't get it, right? Like that, one of the things that we're reading actually is the, you know, the Yale student who wrote in Chinese to her parents about why Black Lives matters. And, but there was a lot of pushback to that, right? Saying like the way you're kind of trying to create solidarity is actually from a kind of, you know, liberal middle class vantage point talking down to working class first gen immigrants, rather than kind of trying to create solidarities about working class, working classness that is shared, right? But as a global condition, rather than telling them, oh no, you're very privileged as an Asian American in the U.S. So that's what I'm trying to get away from. Like there's no perfect language for it yet, but like how to get away from that. Yeah. So.
Great. Sorry, Erin, and then we're going to move to some audience questions.
Yeah.
And so I'll ask, and Yumi, feel free to jump in if you want to also add your question. So Eileen, I really appreciated your presentation. It was so rich, and I especially found your point about the need for us to really examine and include sometimes unruly stories of new immigrants and
right.
whose interests and political orientations may not necessarily be consistent with the political priorities of like the dominant, Asian American activists, to be especially poignant. And, certainly, you alluded to the letters for Black Lives, and, that narrative about immigrants learning to be racist, right? Or learning anti-Blackness through the media after, they arrive in the United States is in itself dehumanizing, right? Because it portrays immigrants as foreign or learning racism or in the wrong place at the wrong time, and kind of depicts them as not having had lives and ideas prior to their immigration. And certainly it's part of, homogenizing impulse to kind of essentialize, racial minorities as either innocent or should be progressive, right? So I was wondering, kind of broadly, how do you create the political unity that's necessary for coalition building, right? Which is, I think, is the kind of the impulse for the letters for Black Lives, while not falling into the trap of asserting an essentialist Asian American identity that needs to be learned by new immigrants.
Yeah, I mean, thank you so much. That's so important to be said. And I'm still searching, right? I'm still searching. I feel like one is a kind of, certainly in my own very small work as an activist, I think of it as being very actively local, right? That maybe the whole search for this kind of homogenizing Asian Americanness makes no sense so one of the things that I work on is Asian Americans in the South, right? And it's a very, very different kind of history. It's a very different kind of subjectivity and interaction. And it doesn't necessarily work with sort of California discussions about ethnic studies, for example. And so how to kind of go deeply local, like, so for Johns Hopkins to develop a program, thinking about really the Mid-Atlantic, or thinking about Baltimore, thinking about the kinds of race relations within the city and within the space and the school districts and the kinds of immigrants. Or in North Carolina, there's a lot more, there are a lot of recent refugees as well, Cambodian, Lebanese, but also a very strong kind of profile of South Asians, and also so kind of high-end tech South Asians and East Asians, right? And so how to kind of, so when we, in this organization I belong to, North Carolina's Asian Americans Together, how do you talk not in generalities, but to specific questions in that community? It's just a way that I personally have dealt with, right? But it doesn't answer your larger, really important question about how do you create solidarities that don't homogenize and don't preach. But maybe goes back to that earlier thing about Kairos. Like, you tell the story that needs to be told at particular moments. You create a plethora of stories so that those stories can be mobilized in different ways for different people at different moments. I guess is how I think of myself as an educator, as a teacher, or someone who is trying to do work in the community. And that's all I can say. So to that end, right?
Can I just follow up with it? I mean, it's slightly different, and then we'll move to that. I just wanted to ask one little, but really to think about these questions around paper and kinship, and kind of to move us into, if you will, a transnational frame.
Right.
Because, if we think about it, like the way in which genealogy is sustained is not, the idea of blood becomes to be materialized,
Right.
as paper.
Right.
And not, and through, for example, something like the household registration system, and so, and then, you could see, for example, in these contexts where the paper son, right, is a way of actually creating a form of, well, essentially creating kinship through paper, which is, as a state form, but is actually that which is actually, it carries the signature of the state, right? But allows people then to live through, for example, something like forgery, right? So the practices of kinship and has always been mediated by, is extensively mediated by paper, and how we think about that in terms of the ways in which people actually carry those practices of making kinship, legitimating kinship in relation to authority, I think might be, something, just thinking about the various repositories of how it is that we make kinship. I'm saying we without referencing a consolidated identity, but state practices around kinship and how those practices are taken up, moved, displaced in the way in which people sustain themselves in new communities, right? So
I think that's so important. And also just to think about, like, so Fengdaoyou, for example. So China has, of course, it's not a household registry system, but so Taiwan, because of Japanese colonialism, long time had the kind of household registry system. But it does, but in informal genealogies, of course, women don't, can't insert. And part of the Fengdaoyou inability to be buried in her ancestral village is the lack of that authorizing by paper, right? She can't fit into the genealogy as an unmarried single woman. And so that in itself is, another whole nother thing to contend with. And also, like, the idea of forgery and the idea of kind of, reinvention is kind of going back to Toby's point, right? Like, also, so much of the immigrant existence is also about reinventing through this kind of borrowed authority of fake papers. And so how to acknowledge that as part of this, discussion of building community, when it's built on a falsehood, right? It's built on,
but that's what the state is always built on. So that's what but should we, I think maybe we should move to some of the audience questions. We have a question from Professor Kuo. She's actually in our, at Johns Hopkins. So I'm gonna actually just read her question if she wants to become a panelist, she can. But she says, thanks for the excellent talk. I'm curious about your experiences of teaching Asian American communities from the prism of Chinatowns. Have you encountered any responses from the students, your undergraduates, that might associate Chinatowns with being an object of Orientalism or self-Orientalism?
Oh, absolutely.
Sorry, sorry, I just
yeah. So while you're coming out, so absolutely. So Chinatowns are, they are objects of Orientalism. They are objects, and they are, as I mentioned about San Francisco Chinatown selling itself, it, also a kind of space of self-orientalizing, right? But I guess part of what I'm trying to get at is that even the genuine experience of fake, that just because these things are sort of catering to touristic or Orientalist desires, it doesn't mean that people's livelihoods or people's kind of genuine families cannot be built from that. I guess that's kind of what I'm trying to get at. This is it's obviously a complicated question with, a wonderful question, but something to think about. So I'm not so hung up on the idea of self-Orientalism. Students talk about it, we talk about it, but so, just getting there. But I know there are a couple other questions. Maybe I could go to that.
So this is from Professor Rodriguez, and actually Professor Rodriguez will be giving the next talk.
Right, I look forward to that.
In our series. And he asks, do you think the multiple illegibilities can be repurposed or weaponized? Oh, there we go. There's, or to constitute interventions on Asian American discourses that reproduce or otherwise rely on police power in their conceptions of justice.
Absolutely. And I just want to share this. This image that was in the New York Times covering the Atlanta shootings, right? Can everyone see my image? So, for those of you who read Chinese, there's a very specific message that's being conveyed. So the New York Times head, was just like, protest in, sort of memorial and protest. But the Chinese banner actually says, police cannot protect us. We must watch out for each other, right? And I thought it was kind of fascinating because this was the lead photo for the article about all the sort of protests that happened right after the Atlanta shootings, but it was never translated. But yet I felt like this is a very kind of specific, police don't solve anything in our communities message, right? Which is kind of Professor Rodriguez's question too, right? So there is that voice, but then you're absolutely right that it's constantly weaponized to be a lot of there is a kind of shifting right of the Asian voting populace right now, and a lot of it comes from the anger of the lack of what is perceived to be a lack of policing in Chinatowns, right? So there's an anger and a kind of increase in wanting more police presence in Chinatowns, because who wants to watch a video of, some elderly granny being beaten up, right? But it is weaponized. And also the things that go viral on WeChat tend to be of Black assailants, even though over and over again, people have discussed that when you look at the assailants in these anti-Asian hate moments, it's pretty much proportional to the kind of profile of assailants in a particular neighborhood. So because there are more white people than Black people, there are more white assailants too. But I think the things that go viral are always a particular kind of image, right? And then it then becomes used as a way of arguing for more policing. So absolutely, this is something that, but I just thought that even that New York Times protest moment that was captured was a very, very specific recommendation that was not explained in English in any way. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. Well, rendered illegible actually in
Yeah.
the language.
Right.
Yeah. So a question from the audience as well. Thank you for explaining the history of fictive kinship among Chinese Americans. Did this kinship also span Asian American ethnic groups? I'm assuming other Asian American ethnic groups. And then when it has, under what conditions did it exist? Does it exist, I guess?
It exists a lot in all sorts of American history. It basically exists in American histories, right? So, Vivek Bald's really great book on Bengali Harlem talks about how for dark-skinned Bengali workers, they were basically illegible. And so it was easier for a lot of them to consider themselves Black, to call themselves Black in order to fit into a particular kind of readability within a city, whether by policing or by documentation. And similarly, Asians of all ethnicities and sort of origin countries often find themselves making certain kinds of choices. And also I mentioned Chinese Exclusion Act and all the subsequent laws. We all know that it's the only quota by nationality, but it wasn't nationality, it was ethnicity, because anybody who was Chinese looking or from Chinese space, or if you were Chinese from France or something, you were still part of the quota, right? So you're still part of the exclusion. And so the Muslim ban, or the proposed Muslim ban, came closest to that imaginary, right? And in that sense, other Asian Americans often played similar kinds of games. I mean, Japanese Americans are a very, very different kind of history because of the gentleman's agreement, right? So there is a kind of early Japanese American history in the US that is different, and has its own kind of lineage. But yeah, so absolutely for other groups. But this is also the issue of disaggregation, aggregation now, right? So should we disaggregate the community because there's so many different experiences, and so when it comes to thinking about like, the student last week, everybody was talking about the Hmong graduate student who didn't qualify for a kind of underrepresented minority scholarship because she was listed as Asian American, so those kinds of issues, or discussions of entry scores for Stuyvesant or Bronx Science, so aggregation, disaggregation is, I think, one of the central ways that we should enter the conversation right now, but how to do so is a good one, is a good question going forward.
Yeah. So, it's somewhat following up on this last question. Yuhan Yang asks, can you trace back how historical events highlight or bring up Asian hate moments into current society or in today's society?
I'm not fully sure. Wait, let me think. COVID is a kind of a great example, right? Like that I don't praise Trump for much, maybe nothing at all, but he's really good at tapping into existing prejudices, right? I mean, so he never really has to invent anything. He just kind of, and so his constant refrain of China flu, China virus, Wuhan virus was incredibly effective because it played right into 19th century plague discourses and Chinese as bearers of disease. And you could say in better times, this manifests itself as a every few year New York Times kind of color, feature piece on Chinatown's not passing sanitation checks, right? Or like weird fish that escape, right? Like eel with legs that run into Central Park or something. There's always that kind of story every few years about Chinese cuisine, Chinatown, Chinese communities. But in points of strife, then it becomes manifested as these kind of earlier hatreds, right? And suspicions that explode immediately. That bat soup was such an immediate trigger for everybody, right? To think about Chinese eat weird food, bring weird diseases. And that's not a news story in any particular way. And so that's just an example of how, that constantly gets tapped into. So part of what I want to do, and, so Clara mentioned that one of the things I do at Duke is Story Lab, is to it's kind of how to flood the market with stories. Like how do you generate lots of interesting stories of all sorts of people, all types of people of the community that can then be, so that you're not always stuck with the same 3 stories that then get, used dangerously in dangerous moments. So that's kind of, what I see as my project.
That's fascinating, actually. This was a really, really interesting discussion. Oh, Yumi, did you have a?
Yeah, maybe I'll just add one thing. I won't ask a question, Eileen, because you've already been asked many questions. But I will add something that I hope that you and others sort of see as constitutive to this conversation we're having. But I just wanted to make a little bit of space for those of us, and I'm one of these people. I have very complicated, an uncomfortable relationship with the category of Asian American. And we've been talking about Asian American and Asian sort of diasporic community building in this talk and previous conversations. But I'm also hoping that this initiative makes some space for those of us who are also questioning, precisely as you're pointing out, the fictive ties through which certain kinds of emotions and feelings are sort of like some of those, like some feelings raise more above others through storytelling and whatnot. But what precisely, as you point out, like these really deeply localized stories, I think what they start to tell us, or what they really start to reveal, is just how multidimensional we all are, and that it's really okay that even if you would be identified as Asian or Asian American by somebody else while you're living in the US, for instance, or elsewhere, but especially in the US, that it's really okay if you don't tie your sense of self to primarily that. So I think, there's I think there's just something to be said for like it being okay that if you don't have like good positive feelings all the time about, that the solidarity is really complicated, and that solidarity comes from addressing like real tensions in your own, like local sort of intimate lives, but, more broadly speaking as well. And, if there is a question in what I'm saying, at some point, I've thought a lot about, what, because good stories are powerful. Really powerful stories also sometimes short circuit like critical thinking capacities, and so, so yeah, I just sort of wanted to add that to the broader conversation, sort of saying that, solidarity isn't just about like, kumbaya, like we are all one, but that it's actually about fighting, and it's about conflict, and it's about facing actually a lot of those like conflicts within, but also without.
Well, I think, Yumi, that's so on point. I mean, that's exactly all the things I think about. Also, I came here when I was 17. So I spent many years not really thinking of myself as Asian American. In fact, my first week of college, I went to the Asian American club or studies and ran back out and went to the international student group because I kind of didn't identify, right? And but one of the reasons, I'll just quickly say that I like working on Chinatowns is I started because I started volunteering in Chinatowns, and I was teaching English in Boston Chinatown. And one of the, at one point, all my students were chefs, like the cooks, local cooks. And so at one point, whenever I walked in Chinatown, everybody would call me Lao Shi, and it was great. I got freebies everywhere. And but one time I was just teaching in front of the class, teaching English, and I thought to myself, I don't think I would have known a single one of these people back in Taiwan. Like there are middle-aged guys, who are from different provinces from me, who, speak a different dialect, and who frankly are different class level, right? And they're not even middle school educated. And so the opportunities of meeting people like this probably would have been small, like when I was growing up in Taiwan. And I thought to myself, but that's a good thing, right? That's the upside of the weirdness of being lumped together, right? That you actually expand your horizons as a human being. The other about Chinatowns is, like I said about Barcelona, it's not necessarily about Chinese people. So Asian America is not even about Asian Americans. So one of the really fun things about sort of thinking about Chinatown as a kind of method is it's made me very attentive to new immigrants in Taiwan. So immigrants so my aunt, before she passed away, started a newspaper that, continued many years, that was published in Thai and Cambodian, Tagalog and Vietnamese. And it was for all the new marriage migrants and working migrants. And now there's Little Burma in Taiwan, there's Little in Taipei. The railroad station on Sundays is where everybody congregates. So I guess what I'm saying is that it allowed Lucy, my aunt, allowed me to really kind of see something that was maybe so centered in Chineseness and detach it from ethnicity to be able to look at other kinds of formations. That South Korea is the same, right? Like 1 out of 6, 1 out of 7 babies are born to mothers who are not born in Korea, South Korea or Taiwan. And so, to understand that kind of phenomenon. And thirdly, I just want to echo what you just said, which is, I don't think solidarity is an identity. I think solidarity is a tactic, right? You come together chiretically when there's something to fight about. And that's when you can make partners with all sorts of people in all sorts of political ways and identitarian ways that you don't have to love them forever, right? It's about a moment in time. And so that's kind of something I think is important to think through. And exactly, I echo your skepticism of making it this kumbaya kind of, we're always fuzzy in this kind of identitarian politics, because it doesn't have to be.
Wonderful. That's a wonderful note to end on, actually.
Right?
It does not have to be warm and fuzzy.
Yes, it doesn't have to be warm and fuzzy. So, but thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you so much to also our audience, also for following the continuity of conversation as we learn more and continue to kind of expand our horizons of discourse around the problem of of responding to anti-Asian violence without an essentialist frame, right? That is precisely the challenge of this initiative. So thank you so much to the audience, and the panelists will just stick around for just a little bit, and the attendees will, I guess can perhaps leave the room, if you will.
And I just also want to
thank you so much for joining.
Thank you. And I also want to invite everyone to join us next Wednesday from 4 to 6 again, when we're going to have a roundtable discussion with current and previous directors of Asian American and Asian diaspora programs. And we'll be circulating an announcement for which you can sign up for the webinar. So thank you all again. Thank you so much, Eileen.
Thank you.
Thank you.